So the year 2050 may seem like a long way off. But if you ask any Republican strategist, the most recent elections in the United States were actually a wake-up call to start thinking about 2050 now. Because by 2050, white people will be a minority in America. Right? This is what America looked like in 2008, with yellow representing non-Latino whites. And this is what America is going to look like in 2050. Now, in 2012, the Republican Party relied heavily on mobilizing its predominantly white base. And what became clear to both supporters and detractors alike is that this is actually no longer a viable strategy. If the Republican Party is going to remain relevant, it will have to speak to the growing pluralism of American society. So here's the question that I want to ask tonight. Is the American Jewish community ready for 2050? We've certainly spent a lot of time thinking about our raw numbers with issues like assimilation and intermarriage and conversion, but even if these issues disappeared tomorrow, even if we maintained our current level of population, the Jewish portion of the American pie will continue to shrink. So, are we going to be ready for this change, or are we setting ourselves up to suffer the same fate as the Republican Party in 2012? Well, let's start off with the good news. The good news is that to be Jewish is to be pluralistic. Over the last 2,000 years, we've become pretty good at figuring out the balance between acculturation and preservation to whatever extent we had control over our own fate. And America is probably our most successful experiment, right? We have worked hard to align ourselves with the mainstream Christian majority while still maintaining a distinct identity. And by any measure, American Jews are disproportionately successful in business, in politics, in entertainment, you name it. We have thrived in America. We have thrived not because of a conspiracy for worldwide domination, right? But in this experiment of pluralism, we had a 1,700-year head start. But here's the bad news. In some ways, we actually still face the same conundrum that the Republican Party faced in 2012 because we become used to responding to one host culture, to negotiating with one group of people. And in many ways, it's a new paradigm for us to think about interacting with a plurality of minorities in building coalitions. It's new to us. Now, this isn't to say that American Jews are without experience in engaging other minorities. Clearly, we have experience in engaging other minorities, but until this point, that engagement has largely revolved around lofty moral arguments. We've constructed this narrative for ourselves that as a success story, we have the obligation to help others who are in a troubled position, right? We were slaves in the land of Egypt. We get it. But here's the argument that I make. In order for Jews to successfully respond to the new America, we're actually going to have to create pragmatic alliances. Now, this is not to dismiss the role of moral arguments. That's still important, but I've learned from my friends in community organizing that the single most important motivator is shared self-interest, working with other people towards a common goal, sometimes in spite of significant disagreements. Now, this idea is not new. It's just smart. And we need a collective mental shift to begin to think of minorities and engaging with them not as an act of charity and generosity, but as an act of strategic and collaborative partnership. So we've started to do this a little bit, right? With the most obvious group, which is, of course, the Latino community. The American Jewish Committee has a Latino and Latin American Institute. The Holy Land Democracy Project teaches about Israel to predominantly Latino Catholic schools. The Anti-Defamation League also has a Latino Jewish roundtable. Basically, we're on it. But if we're going to stay ahead of the curve, we need to start thinking about other communities. We can't just invest all of our eggs into one basket with only the Mormons or just the Koreans. We need to be thinking about coalitions with a lot of minority groups. And tonight, I want to explore the potential relationship with one group that many in the American Jewish community have dismissed because of the difficulty of that relationship, right? The Muslim community here in the United States. Now, I'm sure it comes as no surprise that Muslim-Jewish relations have been defined in the United States by tension and mistrust and fear and suspicion and conflict. Here in Los Angeles, our leaders have made multiple heartfelt attempts to come to the table and engage in consistent relationship, only to have those engagements fall apart every time conflict happens and breaks out in the Middle East. And it becomes this dysfunctional cycle every time conflict breaks out, to the point that I'm sure these leaders ask themselves, why am I continuing to come to the table? Why not invest my energy in a relationship that's easier, where it's going to actually make sense to build a coalition? And I'll tell you, I think it's actually short-sighted to abandon the relationship with the American Muslim community. I think it's short-sighted for 3 reasons. It's short-sighted, one, because of the demographic reality leading up to 2050. It's short-sighted because the way that we have had the Israel and Palestinian conversation in the past does not have to be the way we continue to have the conversation. And we actually need to think about engaging beyond just one issue. So I'm going to break these 3 things down. So let's start off with the 2050 demographic thing. Since 2001, the American Muslim population has doubled in size. Depending on who you ask, they're anywhere from 2.6 to 6 million people in the United States. And they're actually set to double again by 2020 or by 2030 at the latest. This is a community that is growing in prominence and influence. And while in the short term, it might actually be in our best interest to marginalize or to ignore the Muslim communal agenda because it disagrees with a portion of ours, I think that in the long term, we actually do this at our peril. And here in Southern California, we face a really unique situation too. There are about 500,000 Muslims and 700,000 Jews, really substantial communities for both faiths. And if there's any place where there's a potential for experimentation and creating a different positive relationship and moving forward, it's here in Southern California. So the second thing, the way that we have had the Israel conversation in the past does not have to be the way that we have the Israel conversation in moving forward. Now, interestingly, a lot of the methodology behind these best practices are actually based on principles in marital therapy and marital counseling. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? All relationships have conflict. The question is whether we have the tools and the communication skills to be able to move out of past habits of dysfunction and create new healthy ones. It's going to take time and it's going to take investment, but it is possible to make that behavioral shift. Now, third and finally, the last question that I want to address is this question of the bigger picture, right? Israel is core to our identity as American Jews, and that should not change. But sometimes it seems like Israel becomes the only face that we wear for the public. It is our elephant. And it can certainly feel like the elephant in the room in Muslim-Jewish relations. But there's actually a much broader agenda that defines the American Jewish community. And ironically, in order to engage on Israel, we're going to have to start to engage on these other aspects of the agenda, and much of it we share with the American Muslim community. This is one of the most interesting statistics that I share with audiences that kind of triggers people to think a little bit differently. If a person holds anti-Semitic perspectives, if a person is prejudiced against a Jew, she is 32 times more likely to be prejudiced against a Muslim. In the West, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are inherently linked. And yet our two communities have fought discrimination largely in silos. Where was the Muslim and Jewish coalition to fight the anti-circumcision campaign in Santa Monica? Right? And it's not just discrimination that these two communities share in common. There's a much larger agenda where policy stances are pretty similar in terms of homeland security, in terms of civil rights, freedom of speech, separation of church and state, and that doesn't even begin to speak to the basics like education and poverty and hunger. There's tremendous potential for collaboration between Muslims and Jews in America. Nope. So here is a list of Muslim and Jewish organizations working on similar issues. I think it's important to make a disclaimer that a number of these organizations would probably dispute being paired with the other, because of those lingering tensions that exist between the two communities. But it's time to rethink this relationship. And actually, as young professionals, we probably have the most leverage to create momentum in a different direction. In some ways, our leaders are too stuck. Our leaders are beholden to their constituents. Our leaders have too much negative experience with how that conversation has played out in the past. But young professionals, people in their 20s and 30s, we generally have the flexibility and, importantly, the spheres of influence to create substantive transformation. We get that Judaism and the Jewish community must continue to evolve today and in 2050. Now, at the most recent inauguration, right, where Obama claimed the presidency that Republican strategy lost, his remarks included a number of acknowledgments to the broad coalition that made his election possible: women, Latinos, and gays. And regardless of what you or I think of his policies, throwing that out the window, his election represents an embrace of this new America. And as part of his remarks, he shared a tone on engaging with people who we disagree with that I think kind of captures what I've been trying to say in this speech. That we should move forward in engaging even with people whom we have considered to be our enemies in the past. Not because we are naive about the dangers that we face, but because engagement can more durably lift suspicion and fear. Because that suspicion and fear that dominates today, that's not going to get us to where we want to be in 2050. Thank you.